Welcome to the Global List. This is the Global List, where we travel around the world on unexpected journeys with leaders, thinkers, and innovators. I'm your host, David Solomon Bisuni, president of the Bisuni Group, a global consulting firm focused on sustainability, innovation, and impact. Welcome back to the Global List, and welcome to Drone Wars. Drones are redefining the battlefield and redefining war. In the Ukraine-Russia war, we're witnessing the real-time and devastating impact of drones. We're also witnessing considerable innovation and tactical adaptation. So, how are drones changing the battle space, and how will they impact the future of warfare? How are drones reshaping military strategy, tactics, and operations? What's happening on the ground in Ukraine right now, and what critical factors do we need to know? Today, our special guest is Dr. Marina Miron, a friend of the podcast with 2 previous episodes under her belt. And Dr. Miron is a military expert with expertise in cyber warfare, Russian warfare, and she's also an honorary research fellow in the Defense Studies Department Center for Military Ethics at King's College in London. Dr. Miron, welcome back to the Global List.
Thank you for having me, David. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Well, you were. It's great to have you as always. Our listeners get a lot of insights and information from you. As I mentioned before, we've had 2 episodes on the Ukraine-Russia war, and wanted to bring you back in. But this time to really focus on drones and how it's impacting the battlefield as well. But before we jump into that, perhaps you can just, for the sake of new listeners, give a quick summary of your bio and your area of expertise and what you focus on.
Well, absolutely. So what I focus on is, in the grand scheme, strategic studies, which does include military strategy. And my specialty is on Russia and also on Ukraine. So I'm looking at technological innovation in the military sphere, at the force structure. Obviously, a very perhaps sad but an interesting example from a scientific point of view to look at how both sides are adapting to the new circumstances on the battlefield. And I'm also covering different domains, so space, cyber, and the electromagnetic spectrum. So I'm looking at all of those innovations that come in those domains, how these are used, and also focusing on dual use technologies. So it's quite a kind of a broad spectrum, but I'm trying to kind of combine it all to get a kind of a strategic picture, as a grand picture, because if we zoom in too much to the battlefield, we might lose sight of what else is happening there.
Mhm. Understood. And I think that sort of integrated expertise that you have is beneficial, certainly for us as listeners, and I'm sure for military planners as well. Mentioning sort of zooming in, zooming out, let's maybe start there in terms of sort of the big picture. What's the current situation on the ground right now in terms of the Russian offensive over the summer? What's happening in key offensives in key towns like Pokrovsk and elsewhere? And what do you see in terms of sort of key advantages and disadvantages in terms of one side versus the other?
It's a difficult one. I will cover the battlefield as I see it from my research, but I have to say that we have a layer of information war being waged by both the Russian and the Ukrainian side. So there is a lot of opacity in terms of what exactly is happening on the battlefield versus what we get to see both in official sources reported by both countries, as well as different military bloggers, us in specialists like the Ukrainian deep state. And so you have a lot of people offering maps, and then you start comparing maps. For some, there is a gray zone, for the others, there is no gray zone. So I'll do a quick summary. Um, being aware of the fact that it might not be 100% accurate, but I think unless you're on the ground, you wouldn't know what exactly is happening. So let's start with Pokrovsk, which has been dominating the headlines in the past weeks. When it happens every 2 months that Pokrovsk it is in the news. When we talk about the Donbass, the Ukrainian forces have constructed a so-called fortress belt, a defensive line. And Pokrovsk is one of those cities which is elevated, which is a logistical hub for the Ukrainian forces. And this is the reason why Pokrovsk is now in the focal point, because it presents one of the key cities of that fortress belt, of the Ukrainian fortress belt. And so if Ukraine were to lose it, it wouldn't be able to supply its grouping in the Donbass, or it would make it very difficult. Besides, behind Pokrovsk, there is no line of defense, so the Russians could easily advance towards Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. And so the situation there right now is that the Russians have been trying to encircle the city for quite a while now. And we have to bear in mind that these fortifications go back to 2014 onwards when they were constructed. So it is not easy. And the Ukrainians are trying to defend it the best they can, but the Russians have managed to cut off the logistics. And so we're looking at a little conglomeration of Pokrovsk and next to it, Mirnograd. And so it looks like the Russians will be able to break through and possibly take Pokrovsk, at least from my reading of the situation on the ground and the fact that the Ukrainian soldiers are being supplied by drones. So, which is great, better than nothing. But if you have a kill zone on the roads where Russian FPV drone operators are controlling the road, so there is not physical Russian presence, but you cannot send in anything into the city, and the other way around, like doing gas evacs or casualty evacuation is not possible anymore. So the situation is very difficult for the Ukrainian armed forces. And not sure what the Ukrainian military intelligence operation was supposed to achieve, which we have seen in the media just a couple of days ago. But the situation remains difficult. And again, according to official reports, General Syrsky on the Ukrainian side is saying that it's not critical yet, and that the forces are not encircled. On the Russian side, it's the opposite. The forces are almost 95% encircled, and the city is about to fall. So I guess we'll wait and see what happens. That being said, it's not just Pokrovsk; it's also Mirnograd, which are under threat there. And then we have also Konstantinivka. So this we should be considering. It's difficult without a map, probably. So I do encourage listeners to open up the map and look at the location of those places that I'm mentioning. And we also have Kupansk, which is another important logistical point, and leading up to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. And of course, when we're talking about the bigger picture on the battlefield, we know that the Russians have been advancing in the Dnipropetrovsk region, uh, which has not been featured that much on news channels, but I would be very cautious and keep watching that direction. We have Zaporizhia again. it- we have sort of a very slow tempo, slow incremental advances in Zaporizhia, and we have Kherson as well. So I would say overall there is concentration on specific locations of strategic value, and there are incremental gains by the Russians in other directions with differing um, paces, with differing speeds when it comes to taking territory. Of course, we have to also bear in mind that often it's being asked, why does it take so long to take a village, or why is it so difficult to defend a village? If we look at the Russian approach and what they're trying to do, essentially is not just take territory, which is, I think, in the grand scheme, is a secondary aim. The main aim, and for those who like reading the likes of Clausewitz and Little Heart on the Russian or Soviet side, there was Alexander Svechin, who wrote about a very specific type of operations, and they were called material operations. And so those operations were essentially designed to degrade the adversary's military capabilities. So it wasn't about taking territory, it was about causing maximum destruction. And from what I'm seeing, the, the operations in Ukraine are indeed resembling that kind of thought, that kind of approach.
Hmm. So then and thanks for this. I mean, I think it's good to get this sort of bigger, wide lens view of what's happening. So it's clear that uh, a very dynamic battlefield. We're told, at least in the media, we constantly see Pokrovsk, and that's really it. We don't really hear more about these other, these other towns and cities that are also under threat. So it seems like highly fluid and dynamic, but certainly the Russian pressure is concentrating in certain key areas, that could prove pivotal. While you see this sort of concentration of forces and formations around key towns, we do also see the sort of quote unquote air war, if you can call it that, in terms of certain missiles and drones that are being launched into Ukraine. And conversely, you also see Ukraine over the last couple of months developing and launching sort of deep strikes behind and into Russian oil facilities and so on. So what's happening in terms of the sort of I know it's not a conventional air war because we're not seeing a lot of jet fighters in the air, but what's the dynamic in terms of the air component and in terms of long range fires and missiles that are going back and forth?
It is an important component because if we look from the very beginning, those airstrikes started on October 17th, 2022, when General Sergei Surovikin took charge of the quote unquote special military operation. So he was coordinating it then with General Gerasimov in Moscow. And when he took charge, the Russians have adopted this approach, and the reason for that, and there is a lot of speculation on in terms of what the aim is. Um, Many commentators have stressed the terrorizing civilian component when it comes to long range strikes. I My view tends to differ because I'm looking at it from a purely military perspective, and yes, there will be an impact on civilians, certainly, in any case. It cannot be excluded, especially in light of working air defenses, um, as well as electronic warfare systems. But the main point here is to degrade Ukraine's logistical capacity as well as its energy sector. And this has it is a military target. It's civilian infrastructure when it comes to the power grid, but it's a military target from the perspective of it's not about wanting, or maybe it is a secondary aim. I don't know. I'm not going to do the guesswork to impact civilians to a point, to a tipping point. It's about the making it difficult to sustain the forces, to produce missiles, to produce artillery ammunition, to produce drones, because everything depends on electricity. So that is, from a military perspective, very logical, because uh, the Russians have invested quite a lot into those airstrikes, and we know the barrages of missiles that Ukraine is facing with great frequency, sometimes even day after day. And if you look at the types of missiles being fired, such as Kinjals, you have Iskander M's and so on. Those are very expensive missiles to be fired. If you wanted to terrorize civilians, just for that sake, there are cheaper means to do so. And that is my point. You don't use such missiles on civilian targets.
Mhm.
Those missiles are for hardened targets.
So just degrading as much as partly psychological component, obviously, in terms of impacting civilian population, but as you're mentioning, a designed tactical degradation of Ukrainian energy infrastructure and logistics, which are already under pressure. And it seems as if last year this was the case, and the Ukraine managed to get through the winter okay. But in this case, I'm looking at the statistics. I think it was something like 810 drones that were fired, and maybe the 2 dozen plus missiles in September alone that Russia sent into Ukraine. So, is there also a consideration that Ukraine's air defense, and if it's just the Patriot, it's how many Patriot systems they have, is that also a consideration to stretch that air defense?
Yeah, it's one of the considerations, and also the adaptation to Ukraine's air defenses as well. Because what we see is that the Russians are sending a lot of decoy drones alongside, in order to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses. So basically, you need to get to your target, and you want your more expensive, more sophisticated missiles to get to the target. So you will need to somehow get around the air defenses. And one way of getting around them is not physically flying around them, such as that capability you would have with cruise missiles, for instance, but to overwhelm them completely. So that has a twofold effect. On the one hand, you can allow for your more expensive missiles to get to the target, and on the other hand, you're imposing an indirect cost on Ukraine's supporters, because interceptor missiles are very expensive and there is a scarcity of them. So it creates that is why we have the Ukrainian president asking for more air defenses. And I believe a month ago or so, Zelensky even asked Trump if Ukraine could buy more interceptors from the United States, because you don't have enough. And then you have that aspect, and also the fact that you need an echeloned air defense system, or systems. Um, what I mean by that is that you can have long range air defenses, which are supposed to intercept, say, ballistic missiles at long ranges, as the name suggests, and then you have short to medium range and close range. So you have to cover also different ranges with your air defense systems. And of course, the air defense systems are scarce, they are very costly, and interceptors are costly. And this is a dilemma that Ukraine has been facing now for quite a while.
So on the one hand, on the defensive, in terms of defensive posture, you have that pressure there in terms of putting Ukraine's systems under pressure, air defense systems under pressure. You also have this discussion in terms of offensive weapons. The discussion the last couple of weeks has been, of course, on Tomahawks, whether or not the U.S. would provide Tomahawks. We had a similar discussion, a year or two ago about HIMARS and ATACMS. And of course, there's German consideration of Taurus missiles as well, but doesn't look like that seems to be happening. And then you've also got Ukraine developing this new Flamingo missile, sort of that's been able to at least be applied in terms of a long range context. Can you give the listeners sort of before we jump really into drones, but a quick summary of what the difference is and why Tomahawk could be pivotal in terms of either applying pressure on Russia, or why that versus ATACMS versus HIMARS, and even and also what this Flamingo missile has been how it's being used.
Well, those are very different questions. So first of all, I'll quickly mention Ukraine trying to develop its own long-range capability or capabilities while waiting. And if we look at statistical data in terms of Ukrainian long-range strikes on Russian territory, like Russian oil refineries, and so on and so forth, we see that there is a gradual increase. If you compare, for instance, 2022 with this year, the frequency is much higher. Uh, in 2022, there was almost nothing. And now the Ukrainians have adopted, by developing their own capabilities. We will talk about it, and specifically about the Operation Spiderweb or Pautina. Um, they're using drones, mostly drones, to reach those targets. And as far as missiles are concerned, so HIMARS, HIMARS is a close range, so it's not a kind of strategic level weapon, right? So it's a multiple rocket launcher. You cannot compare it to, say, even the likes of Storm Shadow and Scalp, which also have been used by Ukraine. Taurus is kind of the next up with a 500-kilometer range, and designed to destroy hardened targets, underground bunkers. So when it hits the target, so you imagine like concrete and steel concrete combination for hardened bunkers. So first it kind of penetrates, and then once it's inside, it explodes. It kind of um, that's one of the uses of Taurus missiles. And so Ukraine thought, okay, they could possibly create more pressure and create more economic damage to Russia, especially by targeting one of Russia's key export goods, namely oil. That hasn't happened. With Tomahawks, it is different. Now, Tomahawks have twice the range, which is 1,000 kilometers. And Tomahawks can also carry nuclear warheads. And it's a that would be considered a strategic level weapon. Um, the problem is, and I'm surprised that not much has been talked about the delivery platform of Tomahawks. So it's not about giving Ukraine the Tomahawks per se. We have a problem with how many Tomahawks would Ukraine potentially get if it's that decision would have been taken. And as of yesterday or the day before yesterday, the Pentagon said that they still had some spare Tomahawks, which wouldn't affect U.S. stockpiles, but President Donald Trump didn't want to consider giving Tomahawks to Ukraine at this stage. What would Ukraine use to launch those Tomahawks into Russia?
Mm.
And that is a huge problem. So it's not just about saying, okay, well, we'll give you this missile.
Mm.
Great, you have the targets. We will give you, we as namely the U.S. or NATO, will give you the satellite data with all locations of the target. So we will help you with targeting. And these are the targets that you can reach with Tomahawks and do a lot more damage than you could potentially do with drones. The problem is, how are you going to launch them? And Ukraine doesn't have any platform at present capable of launching Tomahawks. That would mean, okay, the land version of Tomahawks that has been scrapped and now revived would have to be integrated with other Ukrainian weapon systems. But the problem is also you need to teach the personnel to use it.
Right, right. And you make a good point, because I just as you're mentioning it in terms of the launch platform, I'm thinking, well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Tomahawks are primarily well, sub launched, aren't they? Or
Yeah.
yeah, okay, so
Yeah. So the origin was the U.S. Navy. So the Tomahawks were for the U.S. Navy, and there is a land-based platform called Typhon, if I'm not mistaken. But as I said, that platform has been discontinued. There are not a lot of them, I think, left after the INF treaty, the end of the INF treaty in 2019. This debate has been revived. I'm not that deep into that debate to be able to say how many of those systems are available, and whether they can be used. But as I said, there are all sorts of problems. And I mean, okay, if you give 20 Tomahawks to Ukraine, um, will that be enough to achieve the strategic effect that Ukraine seeks to generate? Because we have to consider the fact that the Russians will see this um, as an escalation. And they can. We cannot say they're not allowed to have this perception, because their argument is, well, how do we know that a Tomahawk is not carrying a nuclear warhead?
Mm.
And so we have this dilemma: will the the consequences of using the Tomahawks be more, let's say, dramatic for NATO and for Ukraine itself than the actual impact they will have on Russia's military, be it uh, the troops, the logistics, the command and control, or even the oil refineries or drone factories and so on. What I'm trying to say is that it's quite a trade-off, and something that needs to be carefully considered. And of course, we have seen that the Russians have demonstrated their Oreshnik once. Could there be a possible second use? Where would it be? And is it worth it at the end of the day?
Mm.
So a lot
A
of
lot of,
considerations, and
yeah.
I do invite people to check out Martin Libicki's book on escalation. It's a new book where he describes this logic about how two parties, how the other party, if it perceives that the other party has upped the stakes, and they often follow the logic of escalate to de-escalate, and so you are caught in this escalation spiral without any party wanting to get to the to the nuclear or cross the nuclear threshold. But even then, what does it mean? The perceptions differ. So I think within the Trump administration there is some understanding where it could lead. And I mean, because the U.S. would be supplying these weapons, it doesn't mean that Russia would be necessarily responding to Ukraine if these weapons were used.
So yeah,
There are other
no,
there are other countries which Russia could supply with weapons in order to kind of imitate what we've seen during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that could go very, very wrong very quickly.
yeah. So the yeah that the calculus in terms of sort of the decision tree and escalatory decision tree could be quite severe in that context. So it's no wonder then that the discussion of tomahawks has been somewhat chilled for the time being. Um, when we look at sort of setting aside the missile, the sort of long range fires, and the missile context that we've just discussed, we now look at where we've seen a lot of development, a lot of domestic production. Of course, it's on the drone side, and we've seen this continuous development over the course of the war in terms of what types of drones are being used, how they're being used, and what impact they've had. So when we look at that, can you sort of give the big picture of overall how drone warfare has developed in the context of the war, and what would you say sort of the key milestones along the way?
Um, just quickly before I start with drones, I wanted to quickly mention the last missile that you mentioned, which is the Flamingo missile, um, which is being produced by the Ukrainian company called Firepoint, and apparently Denmark decided to build a factory for production of those. Um, Interestingly enough, we have not seen a lot in the news. Uh, According to Ukrainian sources, 9 of those missiles have been used, and the Ukrainians have claimed, because it has a range of 3,000 kilometers, that this missile is superior to Tomahawks also in terms of its warhead. But for now, end of August, there was a scandal concerning Firepoint, where the anti-corruption agency in Ukraine was probing into the company, the agency called NABU, the acronym. And so there seems to be a lot going on in the background in terms of the kind of issues associated with the missile production. And Zelensky came out on October 25th to say that there have been technical issues when it comes to production, but it will all be sorted out, and the kind of production will resume, and the aim will be fulfilled by the end of the year. So I just wanted to quickly mention that, because that would, of course, if Ukraine were to produce those in mass and use them, that would remove the need for using tomahawks, and then you wouldn't have that risk. Okay, now to drones. So from the beginning of the war, what we have seen is the use of long endurance drones, such as Bayraktar TB2, such as the Russian Orlan 10 drones. So bigger drones, very expensive, sophisticated. And those drones were easily shot down. And so it didn't make any sense using those drones. The Russians have employed them from their side. The Ukrainians were using the Turkish drones. And do you remember how much the Bayraktar TB2s were hailed? Those were seen also earlier in Azerbaijan, in Nagorno-Karabakh. But the war in Ukraine turned out to be very different. And so very quickly, the Ukrainians realized that they can use Chinese quadcopters, so much smaller drones on a kind of tactical level, in order to make difference on the battlefield. And what do I mean by making a difference on the battlefield? They could complement their intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR, and improve their situational awareness. And they could use those drones for correcting artillery fire and all those good things. So smaller drones, and these came to be later known as first-person view drones, FPV drones, have become the norm on the battlefield. So essentially, you have sensors everywhere. Now I'm jumping a little bit, but just to say that the big, expensive drones, they were good at the beginning until both sides adapted, and shooting down those drones created immense of costs for both sides, which made them look for cheaper alternatives. And these cheaper alternatives started with Chinese drones. Russians have, parallel to that, started working on their own production of such drones, such as Kub and Lancet. The Ukrainians have started working on their production, creating a lot of drone companies. A lot of businesses in Ukraine switched to drone production, which they received subsidies from the state in order to produce drones or drone parts. And so what we're seeing essentially, yes, we do still have drones such as the Iranian designed and made Shahid 136, later rebranded into Gerain 2, and now we have Gerain 3. Yes, we see those, but we see a lot of small FPV drones, which seem to be the norm. Because if you look at the expenditure of drones, it has to fit your cost benefit metrics. So on the one hand, it has to be cheap, especially if you're using them as loitering munition. At the same time, you have to be able to produce them in mass. And also, they shouldn't be too complex, technologically speaking, because if you have very expensive spare parts in those drones, it's very difficult to scale. And you also have to be able to adapt, because the Ukrainian side will adapt to a specific type of Russian drones and will learn to jam them, to shoot them down, and so on and so forth, as we have seen with Gerain 2. for instance, and same goes for Ukrainian drones used against the Russians. Again, adaptation in terms of uh, counter US systems, more specifically, different levels, kind of different systems associated with electronic warfare have been introduced. And so, summing it up, it's been since year two, this back and forth. One side innovates, the other side adapts, and it's been a con- constant kind of contest between the two sides, which can show more ingenuity when it comes to a development of drones, which can evade adversary defenses, and the other way around. And you had everything from physical defenses, from fences, to cyber, to electronic warfare, and as of 2025, you also have laser weapons as well.
Hmm. And I remember you mentioning this. I think the last time we spoke, just the tit for tat, the back and forth in terms of adaptation and innovation. And I think it was around that point that we started seeing fiber optic drones in the battlefield, and the adaptation to that as well. Before we get into the impact and in terms of the tactical and operational impact. What can we say about the production? You mentioned the infrastructure on both sides. Obviously Russia has a much more, maybe much more significant, much more resource-rich infrastructure that's able to produce a scale and scale up the number of drones that it's able to produce and source from, allies like Iran. And Ukraine on its side is also, I guess, is leveraging some of its civilian society as well as military to produce drones. Is there, as well as sort of technological infrastructure as well, is there one side that has an advantage in terms of sort of let's call it the drone production infrastructure? I would venture to say it's probably Russia, just because it's able to invest more into it and maybe protect more of that. Does that give one side or the other an advantage just in terms of production and scale?
This is an interesting one because the approaches of both have differed in terms of innovation. And as I said before, in Ukraine, there was a lot of crowdsourcing. A lot of companies received subsidies to switch to military production. And the production of drones in Ukraine is also decentralized for obvious reasons. We mentioned the long range strikes by Russia before. And so one company would make specific parts, the other company would make other parts. And so it's not, say, one factory making drones, such as in Russia, the Alabuga, which has expanded over the years, which is producing Iran drones and also the decoy drones. But they're called Gerbera, by the way, if somebody wants to look it up. In Ukraine, it's more decentralized, which has its advantages, but also its disadvantages. And this decentralization is given the situation, but things can be slower. And again, producing drones in mass, as you correctly pointed out, the same way that the Russians do, is then not possible. So scaling the production is a problem. If you read, there are quite a few interesting Ukrainian sources which study the drone industry in Ukraine and how it evolved over the years. And uh, the key problem that all of these point out is scaling the production of drones. It's not so much the innovation and adaptation, it's scaling the production. And as far as civil society is concerned, they have been involved from the get-go. There is another project called Brave One. All of them are dealing essentially with funding, with funding of those companies, and making sure that everybody does something related to the military. And it's not just drones; it's radios and things like that, and applications. everything that can be used basically on the battlefield. And as for the Russians, you have a more centralized, top-down hierarchical system, which is not as flexible, and there is a lot of inertia. So adaptation in such an environment is much slower, because there is feedback from the bottom, from the battlefield. We need XYZ, but by the time it reaches the top, it takes time. And so over the years, from mid 2022 onwards, the Ministry of Defense has been working on simplifying these processes. And so they've been working in tandem with the Technopolis. So it's like their tech development center era. Um, and with big companies like Kalashnikov, in order to promote production and innovation and simplify the whole process in terms of funding allocation and so on and so forth. And this year, they have also introduced a civilian initiative, very similar to what Ukraine does, because they probably saw that that there is a lot of benefit you can gain from that, and also kind of created this project called Voyentech, which is acronym for military technology. And so this project is supposed to simplify, um, basically adapting civilian developed drone or other technologies, mostly drone technologies, for the military. And an interesting piece of news that came out yesterday. So each oblast in Russia will have a sort of like a drone rating in terms of drone production, the amount of drone pilots. So there is a scale like with 10 points in order to rate each of Russia's regions when it comes to drones, like drone production and advancement of drones, how many drone schools they are, how many drone operators are in that region, and how many companies are producing drones, how easy it is to access state funding, and so on and so forth. So there will be like a dronometer for for each region, which is designed again to help create a separate industry within kind of within the Russian military industrial complex, which is also supposed to improve the economy, the Russian economy, which is on war footing. So this industry will deal, of course, with military drones, but also there will be drones for agricultural use and so on.
So it's interesting that you've given us that bigger picture, because now you get the sense that it's a, you know, not, well, obviously competing, but you have sort of this outgrowth of an ecosystem of drones and drone warfare that's goes into the technological base, goes into the civil society as well as military planning, but it is this ecosystem and industry base that is proceeding at a high level that we obviously not seeing in terms of NATO, in terms of the West. I want to come back to that sort of issue of leadership and experience in terms of drone warfare, but in terms of the actual impact, and could you give us a picture of what that looks like in terms of how drone warfare in this war has sort of reshaped or affected operations, tactics, maneuver? What are sort of the key lessons that we need to take away in terms of the actual impact on the battlefield?
Well, so if we're talking about the actual impact, so let's talk about, well, the first things that comes to mind is ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and also situational awareness, because you have sensors everywhere. It's it is affecting maneuverability, logistics, and mobility of forces. So let's say large convoys, such as we have seen at the very beginning of the war next to Kiev, um, that is not something that can be used. So you have to rethink the entire approach of how you use forces, how you design your logistics. For instance, again, here comes the decentralization aspect. You have to disperse logistics, and this is something that has happened to the Russians when the Ukrainians started using HIMARS amongst other things, and the Russians quickly realized that their logistics are being uh, destroyed. And essentially, why I'm focusing so much on logistics is because it is a backbone to military operations. You cannot do anything if you don't have logistics in place. So it goes not only for Russia, but it's also something for NATO to think about. How do we go about this? Dispersing logistics reduces efficiency, and basically, you need to have a very good C3, so command, control, and communications, in order to be resilient, and in order to make sure that your adversary doesn't degrade your operations. So you can see that even this ISR component and even the component of using drones as loitering munitions can have a very profound effect on operational design, on logistics, on maneuver, which again we see both sides are trying to adapt to. For instance, if you recall, when the Ukrainians were in Kursk, they started building um, physical, like metal mesh nets around roads in order to protect their convoys. It was their logistical supply line to Suja, in order to protect it against Russian drones, against Russian FPV drones. And also the Russian turtle tanks. We remember a couple of years ago, because there was nothing to protect
The top, yeah.
the tops,
Mm.
the armored vehicles, the tanks, which were very expensive, and that is why we're seeing Russians using uh, old tanks. They're not using their T90s because they're too expensive and too vulnerable. So they're using old tanks, which can do the job just as well. And of course, we have to think about integrating small. Uh, Small units of drone operators, say at the brigade level. So you have to think of how can you integrate them for optimal interoperability on the one hand. On the other hand, how do you defend against adversary drones, meaning electronic warfare, and other possible counter UAS systems, such as detection systems for detection identification. So you have kind of two options. You have the soft kill, which would be kind of jamming, spoofing, cyber attack, or hard kill, where you physically um, shoot the drone down. And we have seen that the Ukrainians used to do that. They used to use machine guns to shoot drones down, which is why the Russians, for instance, increased the altitude of their Geran in order to prevent the Ukrainians from just shooting the drones down out of the sky. And so those are the changes, or the immediate impact. And of course, you have to, as we have touched upon, you have to structure your industry around the needs of the armed forces. So, on the one hand, you need to be able to scale. On the other hand, you also have to have a very well functioning feedback loop when it comes to feedback from the battlefield, reaching the designers to make modifications and then produce in scale. you have to think about your supply chain as well. Can you produce everything using domestic components? How much does it cost? And so on and so forth. So there are a lot of moving parts that need to be considered in this context, and that both Russia and Ukraine have to take into consideration. So it goes beyond the immediate battlefield, where you have to be expecting drones everywhere, which make it difficult to conceal troop movements, which affect your maskirovka, your camouflage, and so on and so forth. To the fact that you need to be able to manufacture those drones specifically for the battlefield needs, whatever the situation requires. And the drones that worked a month ago or 2 months ago might not work anymore. So you have to be flexible enough to make those changes, and make those changes quickly. And that will give you then the advantage over your adversary. And maybe less applicable to Ukraine and Russia is the rules of engagement, and how those low cost drones, if you use them in urban environment, what is the impact on civilians? What about the harm of using those drones to civilian buildings, to civilians in general? So those considerations will have to be made specifically by NATO planners, because there is nothing in place as far as if drones are concerned. And so
Mm.
rules of engagement of each NATO member will have to be revised, given the new realities on the battlefield.
Hmm. So there's the what you ended on just there, the ethical considerations and rules of engagement, but then there's also the other factors, which are, as you mentioned, integration, interoperability, training, the resources, production, as well as looking at the battlefield anew in terms of visibility and protection, and defensive or counter defensive mechanisms as well. So it's a lot of you're right, a lot of moving pieces. And if I'm the NATO military planner in Brussels or elsewhere, um, i- is there how are they managing the real time feedback in terms of the lessons learned, and is there, I would imagine, an ongoing assessment and digestion of what's happening on the ground in terms of what they need to learn, and is there also a capacity to actually then put that into practice? In other words, if if you were to give the take today and say, okay, is NATO prepared in terms of drone warfare, or would it be the case that it would only be prepared if you admitted Ukraine into NATO because of their experience? Is I guess, yeah. What's the perspective of that NATO military planner right now, and what are they thinking?
It's quite a complex question, actually, and I'm sure it's been debated for a couple of years at least, in terms of lessons learned. How would NATO go about this? And I think there was one interesting example of Ukrainian troops receiving training in one European country, and asking about how do we use drones in operations? How can we better integrate drones into operations? And they were told, well, this is not in our doctrine.
Mm. Hmm.
And so the Ukrainians, there were a couple of interviews on Ukrainian TV where Ukrainian soldiers were saying, well, they have really, really good, great doctrine, great approach, but we don't have the means that they have, and they don't know, they don't know anything about the battlefield as it is now in Ukraine. They
Right.
cannot apply the lessons to Ukraine, and therein lies a problem, because on the one hand, yes, NATO is looking at what is happening, and the current drone incursions or drone sightings have shown how little NATO is prepared to counter that threat, despite the fact that NATO has been looking at Ukraine for a while now and trying to distill lessons, but it's a very complex organization with a complex bureaucracy. And so you have to somehow create this understanding that we need these technologies at the top level. Then you need to create an industrial base that would be producing these technologies for NATO's purposes. And not just the technologies itself. We're talking about drones. We have been saying drones, 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 but we have unmanned aerial vehicle, unmanned ground vehicles, and unmanned surface vehicles, right? So there are different types operating in different domains, and also countermeasures. And one of the countermeasures which has proven effective until the fiber optic drone that you have mentioned, which came out in February last year, that was the Russians first came out with it end of February last year. Sorry, not last year, 25 this year. Is electronic warfare. It's not ingrained in NATO's thinking, electronic warfare. The US has been paying attention to electronic warfare until the end of the Cold War, and then somehow it faded into the background. This is another area which is important for countering unmanned aerial systems or unmanned ground systems and so on. It seems to be very underdeveloped, and so you need to develop those two
Right.
branches, which requires time, which
Right.
requires resources,
Uh,
and
Right.
taking into account this quick adaptation that's happening in Ukraine is
Right.
that whatever you produce today might be useless in 2 or 3 months. In other words, you also need constant updates of your technology in order for this technology to retain its military value, be it deterrent, be it defensive, be it offensive value. So those are the questions that also need to be considered. And so we have, on the one hand, we have we need to adapt doctrine. So you would need war games, you would need exercises, you would need schools in order to teach drone operators. You need research institutions that look at the technology of drones, that are supporting the effort, that are constantly innovating. You need drone manufacturers, and the problem with that is within the European Union, for instance, smaller manufacturers, they don't have access to funding, or it's very difficult for them to get funding. And so you have kind of big players, but big players are not very flexible,
Right.
right? And the smaller ones have no chance. And besides, you also want a long-term contract with governments. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense if you get a 2-year contract. What are you going to produce? So you need to resolve all those problems. But returning to the kind of the steps, what NATO should take, because I'm talking all over the place. I'm sorry. So first look at the types of counter UAV systems, including electronic warfare systems that the alliance might need, and where these have to be deployed, both at the kind of operational level as well as strategic level, taking into account the capabilities that Russia has, for instance. Then doctrine, rules of engagement, exercises, military education. Another area, then, as mentioned before, is logistics. So, for instance, hardening of supply lines, dispersing logistics. That would be one lesson that the Russians have learned. That would have to be taken into account. And of course, some kind of let's say, NATO-wide regulation in terms of capacity building, in terms of requirements, what each partner nation and needs to contribute to this kind of new capability that NATO seeks to acquire. And of course, on the other side, but then NATO would have to work closely with the European Union and with host governments in order to see how this innovation and production and supply chain, how this can be simplified, how this can be reinforced and maybe funded in order to accelerate the production of drones, because you need to train people, but on what do you train them? So you need specific drone prototypes in order to train them on. And so it has to be collaboration between governments, of NATO member states, as well as research institutions and industry. And I think those are kind of the steps to make a very, very kind of rough outline.
Mhm. And I counted them, and I'm just put my notes down here. Those are 8 to 9 key steps, and which are not necessarily easy ones to take, but it seems like there's quite a lot for NATO to put into practice and start building on, so that it can be somewhat ready. I found it interesting you mentioned one of the key aspects there, that the drone, let's say, Ukraine's knowledge and drone warfare and what they're using, same with Russia, what they're using this week might change in 2 weeks' time. And so would the tactics, and so would the considerations going there. So it seems like it's such a fluid environment in terms of learning, and it just merits on the NATO side the ability to be able to put those key steps, considerations into place, but also deal with tricky issues like procurement, and we've seen that itself be a challenge in terms of EU production of procurement and so on. Just a quick aside, Marina, we've hit the hour mark. Should we keep the other questions for another episode, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I just wanted to quickly mention, since to close off the NATO kind of discussion, you mentioned procurement. Absolutely. And I mean, if you look at NATO member states, there is no harmonization when it comes to weapon systems that are being used. And I'm wondering how that can impede interoperability of NATO forces. So essentially, I think for drones, it would make sense to start with the same kind of drones for each nation, and then train them on this, so it's harmonized across the entire alliance, as to simplify the supply chain, the procurement. But then again, you also look at dependencies. For instance, where do you get batteries, lithium batteries, and things like that? So a lot of it is going to be dependent on the geopolitical stance of the European Union in order to be able to procure the necessary components to make those drones.
Yeah, a lot to consider there. A lot to consider. So great. I think we've covered quite a bit here. We still have some more to go through. We haven't discussed Operation Spiderweb and others. I'm sure we will in the next episode. But we've got a lot of really useful insights. And thank you again, Dr. Miron, for all of the insights so far. And I'm excited for the next episode so we can continue this conversation.
Absolutely, my pleasure, and looking forward to covering the rest of it. It's going to be interesting, and it's going to make much more sense, given what we have discussed just now.
I hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of the Global List podcast. We're off to fuel the jet for the next adventure. Until then, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, and be sure to follow our new YouTube channel at the GL Podcast, new Instagram account at the Global List Podcast, and our new TikTok at the GL Podcast. As always, stay tuned for more unexpected journeys with leaders, thinkers, and innovators.